This video is intended to note a few historical points that impacted this area from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s. In the 12 years between 1840 and 1852, more than 1 million people immigrated from Germany to America. They came for a number of reasons, but generally because of the difficult economic times at home, oppressive military service, religious intolerance, and challenges to civil rights. Because of the westward push, the United States offered the opportunity to buy land at relatively inexpensive prices, as well as less government regulations and an easy route to citizenship. From the early 1400s to the early 1600s, our Rogner ancestors lived, farmed, and milled grain in Austria. The move to the Kingdom of Franconia occurred during the early 1600s, and that was for religious reasons. By the mid-1800s, many of the issues mentioned above forced John George Rogner to sell most of his farm. In 1852, he brought his family to Frankenmuth. Frankenmuth had been settled 7 years earlier, in 1845, by Lutheran missionaries. John George and many of his neighbors were still in touch with these early settlers and had learned much about what this new country offered. Even though the Mittelfranken area these folks all came from was part of Bavaria, they were proud Franconians, and so their communities became Frankenmuth, then Frankentrost, 6 miles north in 1847, when 22 families, most of whom had heard of the area from their friends in Frankenmuth, settled there to support the Lutherans already in the area. In 1848, Pastor Sievers and 11 immigrants from Frankenlust, near Bay City and on land owned by his father-in-law, Mr. Koch, K-O-C-H, in Germany. A part of that eventually became Kochville, K-O-C-H, Township. In 1849, Pastor Sievers bought 1,500 acres of land in Tuscola County for $1.25 an acre, with plans to build a haven for German immigrants. In 1851, that community was named Frankenhilf, and 11 years later the name was changed to Richville. Most folks believe the U.S. Post Office changed the name because it shouldn't be about help for the Franconians, Hilf for the Franconians, but rather reflect the rich, fertile land in the area. My mother always said it was because the railroad came to town at that time and everyone said, "Now we will be rich." John George's son Michael Adam was 18 when he came to Frankenmuth. At age 20, he married Maria Schnell, who was 17. They had 13 children before he died of typhoid fever at age 47. In 1875, he bought these 80 wooded acres from Pastor Sievers and put his sons, John Adam, 17, and George Michael, who's always known as Mike, 16, ordered them to build a farm. They lived together in a log cabin they built until June of 1883, when John married Anna Nussholt and moved to the farm she owned on King Road near Gera. In 1884, Mike began construction of the house here on the home farm, and in November 1885 he married Elizabeth Reinert. They had 8 children, 2 boys. The oldest boy, Henry, married Renata Holzai in 1913, and the next son, William, Bill, stayed here on the farm and married Catherine Braun in 1915. In December of the following year, their only child, Erhard, was born. Erhard married Helen Denzer on January 1st, 1939, and they had 3 children raised in this house. Erhard farmed here, supplemented his income by working at area GM plants, until his late 50s when he went to work at Superfoods in Vassar. He retired from there in his late 60s. Ken, the oldest son, and his wife bought the farm from Helen in 2012, and this museum project began a few years later. Immediately inside the door you entered, there's a photo of the sawmill that was set up in the woods here. Some of the lumber was used for the house and barn, some was sold. The beams in the house that support those floorboards, that first section of the house, actually still, they haven't even had the bark removed. The planks on top were from that mill. The original barn was built shortly before John left and burned around 1905. This barn was built by Mike and his friends and finished about a year later. The barn is mortise and tenon construction, and Grandpa Bill always said, "It's all wood, 'cause wood don't rust." The mortise is the hole or the groove, and the tenon is the tongue that fits into it. In this barn, all the major beams are pegged mortise and tenon joints, with a wooden peg driven into a hole drilled to secure the joint. Many of the beams here are 60 feet or more long and cut from a single hardwood tree. In 1910, Mike purchased a used 1906 Buick automobile. And as was the tradition at that time, in 1911, he had a photograph taken of himself on the running board, his son Bill at the wheel, and at the time 3 of Bill's sisters in front of the Richville House Hotel, the largest and most magnificent building in Richville. The hotel was built in 1900 by the Racket Brewing Company in Saginaw, and 1 year after this photo was taken, it burned to the ground on the 4th of July when fireworks landed on the roof. About the time the hotel burned, Bill lost his right arm in a threshing machine accident at the front of this barn. Bill played the trumpet like his dad, Mike, like his son Erhard, grandson Ken, in area bands. In the early 1900s, music was a very important part of life in rural areas, so Bill played in different bands. The photos of the Denmark Township Farmers Band show Bill after he lost his arm. He switched to a cornet because it was lighter, and he learned to play with his left hand, a true study in commitment and dedication. He fashioned a harness and a hook system for his right side and was amazingly good at work on the farm, in spite of the handicap. His wife, Katie Braun, was a descendant of the 300 families that Catherine the Great brought from Germany to Russia in 1763, when she was expanding that country. These folks were referred to as the Volga Germans, and in 1871, all the benefits they'd been promised were revoked, and they began to leave. In December 1899, when Bill's future wife was 5 years old, she came to America with her family. Her dad and oldest brother both served in the U.S. Armed Forces during the First World War, and their stories are shown in the hallway. The Braun family were migrant workers, and working in area sugar beet fields was how she came to the Rogner farm and met Bill. This barn project started as an attempt to share with grandchildren a bit about what their ancestors accomplished and the circumstances involved. A large section was devoted to Helen's family as well, because her dad, Mike Denzer, following World War II, was a prominent area businessman, a butcher, an auctioneer, and the mayor of Reese for a dozen years. When farm neighbors learned about this project, they began to share their ancestors' items as well. So, the Reif family, the Bierleins, the Buhingers, the Matsons, the Aarons, the Kines, the Brechtelsbauers, the Schulkbeers, the Reinerts, and a dozen more all shared their grandparents' and great-grandparents' items. After the Frankenmuth News printed a feature story, Mrs. Middeldorf donated her grandmother's pump organ. Randy Bierlein shared the family's sleighs. Brian Feist and Mary Lou Deckard shared collections. And now about 30 area families are represented with donations to the museum. The hallway is divided by the first 3 generations and includes photos of the first barn, the team of horses, the house with the summer kitchen still attached, mortgages, deeds, a dozen photos from the time. The room to the left is designated the music room. The second room is devoted to a history of beer in Frankenmuth, as well as antique lighting, antique bag scales, grocer scales, candy scales, a large array of local area business promotional gifts, such as about 50 yardsticks, calendars, ashtrays, thermometers, and the like. The main room includes everything from early farm machines like corn shellers and a fanning mill to tools and signage. There's a collection of kitchen and household items, washboards, irons, cast iron skillets, as well as hunting and fishing antiques, a corner dedicated to Mike Denzer, and the Reese Locker plant. The 48 Star flag was from a military funeral of the Matson Army veteran who confiscated the unique concentration camp officer's sword that hangs next to it. The 50 Star flag was autographed by Bob Heft from Saginaw, who designed our current flag as a junior in high school. He signed this one on the first anniversary of 9/11 at Ground Zero, and it was shared by Art Reinert. You can even find in that main room the story of Malachi the Moose. This lower level, the original cattle milking area, is now dedicated to pre-tractor implements and tools and is still being developed as we receive more gifts. So wander and wonder at what our ancestors accomplished.